Dr. Yuvraj and Dr. Archana to take over this session. Over to you, Dr. Yuvraj.
Thank you, sir. So I'm happy to introduce Professor Shyam Divakar. So Shyam Divakar is the lab director of Computational Neuroscience and Neurobiology Laboratory, a faculty fellow at the Amrita Center for International Programs, and an associate professor at the School of Biotechnology. He is the Institute Integration Coordinator and co-investigator of Virtual Laboratories project, a major virtual labs initiative supported by Success Mission of MHRD, Government of India, and principal investigator of few other actually projects funded by DST, Government of India. He was awarded the Young Faculty Research Fellowship under the Sir Visvaraya PhD scheme by Department of Electronics and Information Technology, Government of India. In April 2016, and he holds a PhD in computational science from University of Milan, Italy, and had worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Physiology, University of Pavia, Italy, before joining Amrita. So with this introduction, we can listen from Shyam Divakar, sir. Sir, now the platform is yours, so you can carry on.
My very good morning wishes, my pranams to all of you. Thank you, Dr. Krishna Mohan. Thank you, Dr. Yuvraj. It's amazing to be here and to address all of you in this very august audience. I can see a very large number of people, and I'm very, very honored to be amongst you this morning. The next set of talks is going to be based on what I experienced on this 10-year project that we started. Although it's a project that I never intended to start, it was one of the best projects that has been turning my life around. So with that as a small beginning, let me start sharing screens. And today's talk, or generally this presentation, comes from a very personal experience. So as faculty members, we all struggle with our workload. We all struggle with what we want to do. And this is exactly what we also experienced here. I'm an engineer turned physiologist. So my background's basic engineering, electronics and communication, but I moved to neuroscience towards my specialization. So beyond that, so one of the biggest challenges that you see is that all of us, and COVID has already told us that by a stronger message, we are struggling as faculty members to look at how to improve quality of both the teacher and the students. And that's one of the biggest challenges of these modern studies. So with that as a very basic thing, I'm going to say most of us, I'm going to assume most of us know what a virtual laboratory is. And we all know without any problems how much of a difference, a cognitive difference, is a struggle between student at a PG level or a undergraduate level compared to a student at in a school or in an environment. Our challenges are very different. Some of you should be parents of children, and that already tells you a lot of how involvement of people change when it comes to purely online or online technologies. I'm going to steal the show by saying that there are lots of experiences in this today's presentation, more than what would be reported about phenomena. Let me start with a very simple example, very strong example. Last year, my colleagues, Dr. Sandeep, Dr. Brajesh, and Dr. Praveen, executed a very critical operation. It was on a baby, on a very small infant, the picture of the infant on the news press on the right side, and a very young mother going through the process. The problem was breastbone reconstruction. Typically, what would be a fatal disease if you let it leave, or a hole in the heart in simple sense. We had a infant scenario where an infant was missing a sternum, the typical breastbone that you would call, on a 9-month-old baby. And this was a surgery that took 7 hours to complete. But the idea was not the surgery wasn't difficult. The difficulty was to understand where and how to do the surgery. And in fact, that was achieved by creating a life-size model a 3D model which was printed from our 3D reconstruction labs attached to our hospital, and because of which doctors could decide how to navigate, how to reconstruct. So what they did is 1 week before the operation, they started practicing on a 3D model. That tells you how significant even technologies that are ICT related are going to change. And that's why I believe nanoscience, for example, we also have a nanoscience group, a strong nanoscience group led by Dr. Shanti Kumar Nair, our Dean of Research. And our nanoscience has been looking at scaffolds and tissues. And this is a big constant challenge where you look at how to use technologies that you know are well done for something so critical. With this as an example, let me tell you my basic training and basic research in our lab is not just virtual labs. Most of the time, what we do is to understand using neurons, typically in vitro in India and data in vivo from Europe and collaborators abroad. So what we try to do is to understand how neural circuits exist. Typically, my work started with building, let's say, single neurons, detailed single neurons, which means we would build sodium channels. We would understand how membranal ion channel structures would behave. We would connect it to ohmic equations, putting them into Markovian models, putting them into mathematical structures called cable equations. We would reconstruct detailed single neuron models. Around 2009, we also started expanding to building circuits, because circuits in human brain are very different from how you would see phenomena happening at a single cell level. When you put them together, you can generate complex nonlinear behavior like local field potentials. You can now, for example, we are working with the Human Brain Project looking at fMRI reconstruction or BOLD reconstructions, blood oxygen level dependency circuits. These are large, complex structures, complex data that come out from, let's say, a bunch of neurons, a couple of million neurons, for example. On the other hand, local field potentials are much smaller. So why am I saying that? Because this is a part of the work. You have to understand, like all your structures, all the nanomaterials and material structures, brain is also a physical structure with a lot of complexities. In fact, it's an active working matrix. And this is an example of our, so let's say 800 micrometer cubed region of the crus 2A, the motor cortex of the rat cerebellum, where we simulate, let's say, the data that you just saw spinning is around 20 terabytes a day. So when we run a simulation like this and we want to take a 2D or 3D surface out of it, we need to run something like 20 terabytes of data a day. So it's not, why is it used for? We use it to make, let's say, decisions on how future experiments should be done. How do we constrain physiological experiments? We also, a colleague of mine uses that to do that, but primarily what I try to use it is to predict functional changes in circuits. So what happens during autism, what happens during epilepsy, and so on and so forth. So what we construct is like these kind of circuit examples, which would help experimentalists to match an understanding with what's happening in the circuit at these common levels. So with that, if you hear a break or if I'm not audible, please make sure that you enable your audio and tell me what's wrong. So otherwise I'm going to continue as if things are perfect. So sorry for that. With that, we started creating very large structures. So for a typical lab scenario like this, I was asked the question, how would I train thousands of students? Typically, forget thousands, tens of students. Let's say not even 100 students can sit. Typically, these are equipment, and like your equipment in labs there, where experiments are performed by one student, typically a PhD student, sitting on a device for a long time. So this question came up in 2009. So this is when we started looking at a very new pedagogical angle. The building, which is probably something that I should not tell all of you, actually I should hear from all of you, the division of what we call as a physical laboratory. A physical laboratory is always a challenge. Physical laboratories define a complex set of people interacting, a set of people and devices interacting, people and equipment interacting. So we had challenges. So we defined as a consortium, we defined In India, we define virtual labs as equipment to complement the use of time or lack of a facility in terms of either availability or in terms of time for students who cannot be on a site. For example, people at SRM Chennai would be lucky if they are at home. How do you provide them a complementary skill set? We also defined a lab as a facilitator for a faculty member or a teacher to provide quality education. Quality education need not limit itself to a 40 minutes or 60-minute classroom session. We wanted to see how the teacher can be freed in 5 minutes, and the rest of the time he or she can be interested in evaluating or understanding how much perception goes into a student. We also looked at it as a researcher. It's a very tough challenge. India is a land of huge advantages, but at the same time, we have some disadvantages. Like we have a big number who want to share the same space and resource facilities that are limited to it. So we said a virtual lab should be a resource that allows sharing costly. I use the word costly, not in terms of money alone, but also in terms of time. So how do I look at efficiency in terms of time and benefit in terms of resources? And finally, I'm talking about a very critical element that none of us should miss: how to motivate younger students without our focused engagement. I'm talking about kids. I might actually tell you a story a little bit later. So this was our definition of virtual labs. Today's definition of virtual labs needs a little more stylish way of saying. In India, in 2009, April 2009, IIT Delhi called in for a large consortium meeting, and along with the other members, IIT Kanpur, Kharagpur, IIT Bombay, IIT Guwahati, IIT Roorkee, Dayalbag, NIT Surathkal, College of Engineering Pune, we said we'll build for any set of disciplines, we need to look at least 3 types of labs. We said that there could be a lab, especially when you consider engineering, you need to consider a modeling or simulation based lab where you don't have to worry about anything that is real. Everything is simulated for you. We have to, for most of the people like you and me, we need to look at simulations are interesting mathematical toys, but they are no more than that. So we need to invest in a measurement based scenario, which means that I need to give real experimental data into a simulator that can be used to train or to test students. I'll give you an example. How would you teach a student what to err, to make an error or to study an error? Error analysis is something very critical in every experiment. How do you teach a student what to err? And I'll give you a very nice example. A colleague of mine, Dr. Prema Nedungadi, who's the head of the chairperson of computer science, she ran a center dedicated for educational technologies. And when she developed a learning tool called MedSim, which is also free to access. If you Google, if you search MedSim on in the internet, you'll come at medical simulators, where we called it the virtual patient case. I remember her in her first talk, she said, pardon me for saying this, how does a medical student know which would kill a patient? By the way, ethical norms doesn't allow you to use it in a medical school, but the terminology is not allowed to be used in a medical school. In the medical school, it's a virtual patient case study. One of the scenarios that medical students, we found out were very upset was the ability to test a particular drug or a pharmacological combination of a drug on a patient. So a MedSim allowed a patient to be tested with some extreme combinations, also a case study. We said that also is critical in engineering. We also see that today, and all of you know that even more than me. Many of you definitely know what I'm talking about, even much better than us. So we said measurement labs are also very critical complementary skilling tools. And finally, if you want to move even closer to reality, we need to put the equipment on a remote site, and that is called remote triggering or remote controlled experiments. Let me talk to you about a concept design. I'm sorry, I borrowed a basic explanation from biophysics, which is much closer to me, but whether it's molecular biology, whether it's material structures or molecular asymmetry, you can talk about all these things from the same phenomena. So in fact, I believe a virtual lab concept, if you develop one, all of you will develop one. Some of you would have done several already. If you have already developed one, you already know that you can develop a virtual lab either as a modeling concept or as an informatics concept or as an education concept. As an education concept, you say a virtual lab is a domain dependent platform, a platform where you can learn X number of things. Or let's say you would call a virtual lab as a platform to understand or to repeat or to test or train experimental protocols. Or you can call it a self-test platform or a self-analysis platform. Let's say pre-test. I'll come to it, case studies a little bit later. You also call it informatics. Some of you might be interdisciplinary scientists here. I'm sure a lot of you doing a bit of informatics. So as a virtual lab is a multi-level data aggregation phenomena for a person from a particular discipline. For example, for a neuroscientist, it's a neuroinformatics delivery platform. So which means that I'm talking about database connectivity. I'm looking at mechanisms that connect us, and alongside what happens in terms of multi-level data. And in terms of a very well-known basic concept, VL, virtual labs, is also a simulator or a modeling concept. And this is where people worry about whether it's a modeling concept or an informatic concept. You will understand that most virtual lab people, either being physicists or mathematicians or engineers or biologists, many of my colleagues in the School of Biotechnology are biologists. We had to learn database connectivity. We had to learn a little bit of programming. We needed to learn a little bit of integration. Integration in terms of integration is much higher than what we perceive from a computer science angle. Integration is actually taking what you know from your field of knowledge and putting it into a translation, just like the way a doctor will say, I have heard a lot of people here when they talk about holistic education or holistic phenomena, they use thinking from the heart. So as a person who studied a little bit of anatomy, I would say heart is a pumping organ. So when it comes from an integration angle, you realize that the terminology heart would actually imply to the psyche or the construct of the psyche as a being. For example, the same way in every phenomena, every field, you'll understand that there is an integration approach that is the hardest for many students to assume when they are beginners. Everything else comes from a textbook, everything else comes from a teacher directly. The hardest time for a researcher to convey in a modeling phenomena is the integration. So a virtual lab is a fantastic phenomena to look at all these three concepts all together without any of our effort, which means that all of you here, many of you here, will, when you build virtual labs, you'll realize without struggling any other phenomena, you provide education, you provide informatic background, and at the end you arrive at a modeling angle that would aid different phenomena. When I say modeling, I'm not talking about simple simulators. I'm also talking about very expensive, mentally expensive phenomena that are today. India is not the only nation that's doing virtual labs. Everybody did it. In fact, in 2009-10, we had MIT visit us because they found our virtual labs as cheap and much faster than what they did in the US. We found out in their meeting that at that time, Europe had launched Lila, Library of Labs. And Lila is a very nice project. Lila started off with the similar goals like MHRD, but they were not as big or as large as MHRD's virtual labs mission. There is Vital Labs from Ohio. There is LabShare from Australia. There is a beautiful, Australia's, a couple of Australian universities have also put in a couple of labs. There is the GoLab project. There's NASA's for biologists and biotechnologists. If you Google, NASA was one of the first few labs that virtual labs that were educative. And if you have small children in school, to kindle their excitement, people used to do this NASA's virtual lab, and they would say, try to tell me what happens, like a hole in the wall experiment. So HHMI was another very interesting. The Howard Hughes Institute also had set of interactive very preliminary or basic labs called V labs, much more earlier than the Indian labs. So this is not a very unusual phenomena across the globe, even before the pre-decade phenomena. So I'm talking about 2009, 10, etc. So even 10 years ago, online laboratories were very common. When I say online laboratories, I'm using the term online laboratories in general, but it's basically the same when you say virtual laboratories in India. So what can you do? What can we do? I'll tell you from our perspective. So as group of interdisciplinary scientists, as doctors, as professors, as teaching faculty of different universities, many of us gathered together and we started testing what works and what doesn't work. For example, we started saying where we fail, where we don't fail, etc. And it was very easy for the engineering field to choose a couple of domains. Computer science was already virtual, and it was very easy to start a lab. But what was the challenge? Domains like WNA, wireless and network applications, cybersecurity, were not previously conceived. We did that. I mean, the national mission did several of these labs. I'm listing the examples where we tried and we were succeeding. So the entire biotechnology and biomedical engineering came into my hands, and it was very nice. A colleague of mine, our dean, became the national coordinator. He did all the administrative bureaucracy work and coordinated us, while I was very happy trying to set up a team and develop labs. It was a fun time. So I had something like 20 people working, 25, 30 people working with me. A set of students would be interns, but the rest of them were all staff. We would hire them. Some of them would be biologists, some of them would be physicists, some of them were animators, 2 or 3 of them were animators, 2 or 3 of them were graphics people. So it was a big exercise and I was not used to it. I got to tell you, I think there is a lot of arrogance that comes when one starts a career and gets a good grant. But that's where a project like this, which had a two-month deliverable, started changing a person to become more perceptive. I would say, I wouldn't say we ever became, I ever became humble, but it was very perceptive. It taught a large set of lessons. It taught me a couple of lessons. When you develop a virtual lab, you realize how important your colleagues are, the working colleagues are. You need inputs from several of your teaching faculty. It brings you together as a family. The second one, pedagogically, even if you start in one discipline, you can never stay in that discipline. You need to know more than one discipline. My mechanical engineering colleagues came to me, worked with me as a biology discipline, biotechnology and biomedical discipline. We had students from electronics and communication engineering walk in and said, can we work on developing and deploying labs? So this was very challenging. So since I was lucky enough to know a little bit of the background, it was much easier to work with all of my colleagues. So computer science, this is a point, virtual labs can bring a phenomena of understanding, which can say all of us are one, as facing one common problem. How do I build better tools that can help facilitate skilling knowledge? So if you look at vlab.co.in, which is the national website, you can see all, whether it's IIT Kanpur, whether it's IIT Delhi, whether it's NIT Surathkal, Dr. Gangadharan's team, or if you look at any of them, when I say team, there are institute coordinators, and then there is the national coordinator, which is the director of IIT Delhi, taken over by Professor Ranjan Bose. All of us, around 280 faculty members, could pool in together, and that was very interesting. We realized a few lessons few years later. So 6 years later, we realized that we needed to talk to each other much closer. We needed all institutions to work together. We need not be any competition. We are actually complementing each other. And if you develop more, you can challenge how much of a change can be brought in. And even if 2 professors do the same virtual lab, the learning experience gathered by the student can be so different. So we are never science is so amazing in that concept. So once we get into virtual labs, we can learn some of those lessons. And I'm talking from a developer angle. So this is what you can do. We can set up a nanoscience lab. You can set up nanoscience experiments, target them at undergraduate level and postgraduate level. You can associate you can actually say, all of us, let's try multiple experiments or the same experiments at the same time. So none of this causes any trouble. That's the best part of it. What you might do is you might have some faculty members who are extremely lucky and talented to get out with the first set of outputs, but that's not going to change any of your picture. For example, a colleague of mine remotely triggered a scanning electron microscope. So the government of India came up and said, amazing experiment, but tell me how many of your students are going to use that remote triggered experiment? How many of Indian students are going to use that remotely controlled experiment? That was a question. We didn't have the money to support constant experimentation, and the equipment was so expensive that they didn't have the time to give it for more than a few many hours support behind the scenes. So you realize that your experiments can always teach and enable you with different knowledge. So those are things that you can do when you set up a small project. I'll come to what we can do again a little bit later towards the end to give you some inputs on personal experiences. These are personal experiences from my side, not from my colleagues. So that can also help some of you. This is an example. So in Amrita, we called it virtual value or virtual Amrita laboratories universalizing education. And this one typically meant that we added a real lab video component. We added, we built in an LMS. We offered a national, let's say a national coordinator was assigned. So we had to look all, for example, IIT Bombay's, IIT Delhi used to send us experiment list and we had to approve it, for example, if it belongs to this discipline. So there was a lot of peer review and it builds a lot of working together. So even now, after years of that virtual proteomics labs, Sanjeeva and me, we still talk to each other about how to look at deploying data intensive laboratories. One of the uniqueness that we had to struggle with or we had to build with is that we developed the early version of the learning management system for the virtual labs. So if you want to start a college or institute level virtual labs phenomena at the, let's say led by SRM, for example, please remember that even if it goes multi-campus, deploying it on a HTML page may not complete the virtual lab process. You might find it convenient to have a nice Sakai or a edX kind of an LMS that can help you. In fact, we built our own LMS. I'll come to it. We call it the CampVL, just for virtual labs. So what did we do? We built 330 plus at Amrita alone. We did 330 plus online experiments, all free. Over the last few years, we conducted 380 workshops. Let's say approximately 6,500 students, teachers attended the workshop, and a lakh 100,000 plus students attended it. And we have a phenomenon called a very nice outreach program called the Nodal Center Outreach Program. What we thought we would do initially is ask people how they feel and to facilitate experimental training. And this was part of the Nodal Center process. I'll come to it if we have time. I'll come to the development part of it. What's interesting is this part. I'm going to tell you not how to develop. I'm going to tell you how we did it and where you may, what you may avoid to develop a good lab. So to develop a laboratory, you need very little physics. If you know 8th standard physics, that you're already good with it. Or let's say 10th standard physics, not 8th standard. So as a faculty member, many of my colleagues who were averse to, let's say, mathematical skills, like let's say if I would ask them, can you do matrix multiplication in matrix computations in a linear algebra package? They'll say, please, we are not bioinformaticians, we are biologists. But even people who shied away from mathematics, most of our colleagues do it. So I'm just joking around. They know everything what I speak. In the physics of real world, at the level of a virtual lab, you need only very basic physics, Ohm's law, cable theory, or let's say basic equations, flux, let's say diffusion, Fick's law of diffusion, very basic things. And even Fick's law is not needed to be implemented. You can implement them if you want to, let's say, study certain complex processes, but on a basic virtual lab, you don't have to worry about it. My engineering student came to me and said, can I look at Navier-Stokes? I said, definitely. Fluid dynamics of computational finance, you can build models out of it. So in a physical lab, the first exercise that you would do is something very, very significant learning process, both for us as faculty members and for the student whom we are intending to it. We call it the translation from the real world to the abstract world. The very first step that you would do is a storyboard sketching. Please do assume, I actually thought it was a very trivial exercise. It's just looking at something and drawing it out. But I was completely wrong. The phenomena where a difference happens in the real use of a virtual lab is when you realize what is to be sketched and kept and what is to be sketched and rejected. So sketching, I'm using a simple picture. In the initial years, 2009, 2010, we asked an artistic person to draw all the scenes from the video library. So we recorded a video, we asked him to draw it. That was how we define sketching. But that's not the only sketching. A sketching means an experimentalist sitting down to identify key scenes or key activities, actions, not just scenes, actions in a physical laboratory process. The second one was animation. Animation is out of our hands, but today there are very amazing stuff. So for example, I love this Jonathan Weber website, Jonathan Schroeder. He has the physics.weber.edu, and Jonathan Schroeder puts up content which every one of us can do it in our pastime. If you're really bored overnight, it takes like, let's say 30 minutes to develop a physical virtual lab in HTML5. And that's the link that I put in on the site to learn to code. You can Google it. You just say Schroeder or coding in HTML5 and you get it. It teaches you how to do very basic stuff like that. If you know the stuff, your students would know 20 times the same content. So you would very easily ask them to develop animation. So it's not going to be a struggle, not like 10 years ago. One of the things that we did, we were lucky and very unlucky. In 2009, Adobe Flash was an amazing platform. Animations were so realistic. We could do 2D, pseudo 2D, 3D, pseudo 3D, everything. So we did pseudo 3D or 3D style animations and use them to create our simulators, animations and simulations. So it looked like a real experimental setup with some math behind the scene. What happened is when Apple rejected Flash, every other company had to reject it. And to this year, we realized that December 2020 could be one of the last years we can see Flash alive, supported. That means that in a year or two. So I would recommend, please don't do, even though animations are interesting in such platforms, try to go for a platform like HTML5 or a Canvas platform that is much more conducive or easy for your application. Once you have that, you have the front-end skills, you need to look at a student or a team or a computer science colleague or an interdisciplinary geek among you who will already set up the backend for you. It's very easy. Backend defines how much experiments come out from your team. So even if you develop one experiment, you can tweak it and create hundreds of experiments from the same code that you generated. So setting up a lab team would be very challenging. So this is the developmental process. That's all. I mean, all you need to do is make sure that you pedagogically pay attention, call them sketching, put them on board, define that as a drawing into a computer screen. You can draw using different tools. Nowadays, with a laptop and a pen, you can draw very nice stuff. You can use those graphics or you can use icons that are freely available to reconstruct a lab scene. So how do you reconstruct it? You can connect using HTML5 or JavaScript or whichever tech that you want to use it, or you can use a combination of both. As many of us talk about it, most of this has to come from human experience. So our experience with the platform was extremely critical. In fact, we had a paper in IEEE Transaction and Education just about how platforms deliver content differently. So this was Raman et al. I think it's, I'm one of the authors too, but Professor Raghuraman from our business school actually did that work in the early years. So we looked at what is called Collaboration and Accessibility Platform, or CAP virtual lab platform, for implementing and deploying virtual labs. We built it ourselves. Today, if you ask me, is that okay? You don't have to rely on that one platform. Even though the platform is very simple, you have different platforms that delivers much better content. You can look at edX. You can look at, there's a very nice platform by my colleague Venkatesh Chapralla from IIT, IIIT Hyderabad. That's going to be open source. I think should be on his GitHub. There are other platforms that IIT Bombay or somebody else had developed. So you might actually Google and find out Indian platforms, non-Indian platforms, and so and so. MIT has the iLab framework. iLab was not very conducive for some of our applications, so we didn't use it. So these are some of the examples. What do you want to do? A virtual lab is only a simulation becomes a virtual lab if you can put in content, if you can manage what its usage patterns are. You can look at some of the metadata that is critical for teachers to understand what happens. And you have, let's say, phenomena like scheduler, authentication, and today, for example, being on a COVID scenario, you understand online education is all about guessing how much time your student spends with you or with your learning tool. So we understand that there is a lot more that as a group we should think about compared to the pre-COVID phenomena, the before COVID phenomena. So I'm talking about the operational flow, the implementation phase, and the development phase being very much intensive pedagogical practice not for common people, but for professors like us. Dr. Yuvraj, if you can tell me when the time is up so I can stop earlier, please let me know. Thank you. And like I said, there are 3 of these experiments time: interactive, simulation, remote triggered. I'm going to skip and say interactive animations are amazing for biologists, are amazing for chemistry, are amazing for, let's say, complex sciences. Complex sciences meaning sciences where mathematical complexity is much more diverse. In physics, it might be less impressive for a student, etc. And you can provide steps to build it. For example, in one of my first labs, I looked at neurophysiology. So where in my first experiment was to do how we take the brain out from a Vista rat in our labs, in Indian style labs. So we actually use animations to teach students complex scientific procedures. There was no mathematical simulation. There was just a procedure process. It's a very critical thing. What we used to teach in 6 to 8 hours could be finished in 20 minutes in a classroom. So don't trivialize animations. Animations can teach a lot more if the sequence are identified. For example, setting up a microscope is very critical, but it's not just a simulator, but you also have to show in steps what a student should do or should not do. For example, discarding biological hazard. A simple process. The second set of experiments are mathematically simulatable experiments or simulation experiments. We did a very low cost light microscopy experiment where students could turn it, but we created a GUI, a graphical user interface that looks like a real microscope. So even though this is a pseudo phenomena that tells you where you can avoid graphics and where you can add parameters. And finally, an experiment that we couldn't sustain till now, the concept of remote laboratories. My colleague, for example, still through her project sustains a landslide laboratory right next door to our lab, and I feel very jealous of her. She's an amazing professor. She not only has landslide sensors in Himalayas and in Western Ghats, but also in a lab that actually can allow students to learn how to create, how landslides are being created. So one of the challenges here is that real equipment gets damaged over time. It's expensive to maintain it. So for example, all the biology related microscopy experiments, we had to take it offline because Government of India said it doesn't scale. So if it doesn't scale, there's no point. These equipment could be, the only thing is that passion for allowing people to access it definitely changes. But the nature of students, typically, I would say, we had a fun experiment where we set up these experiments, and around 4,000 students from community colleges in the US started using it overnight. They would say, "Oh, we did this experiment." They would leave us feedback. So this was very challenging. So we currently have somewhere around 496,000 users, 496,000 users, and in that number, around 4,000 or 5,000 were community college students from the US. A few were from the rest of the world, but majority of them were Indian students. We also tried in 2009 to 12, we also tried something extra. So if you're very keen on giving a student a perceptive feedback, you can think about integrating haptics. All this will add in collaboration with your computer science colleagues. It's much easier, or electronics engineers in your group, and they can teach you how to build simple haptic devices. For example, we simulated forces on an object like in simple harmonic motion using a glove. This was a glove that we did, let's say, in 2 weeks or a week. By connecting this glove, students could get a feedback of some one-way, I mean, it's a one-way device. A student, a BTech student came to us, used the same device and said, let me do sign language. So you can take a sign language device and convert it as a virtual lab device as well. That's what I wanted to inform. And today, the same group that started with these kind of gloves is called Computer Human Interaction Group, AMMACHI Labs. Amrita, they developed a device called APTA. This APTA is a 9-skill device. In fact, it's being used by L&T. 70,000 L&T workers are being trained for their plumbing, for their skilling work on this APTA device. And it's basically the power of a haptic device. You cut down the cost by approximately 60 to 70%. Definitely, these are not replacements. These are only complements. So you may have to train your students in real labs. These are just examples of it. So let me give you a very basic example. Because of the passion that you can do it, now we are all at home. We can do a lot of things from home, and these are cheap experiments. You can develop experiments that are remotely triggered by using very cheap devices. We started with National Instruments. They were very expensive. We switched to Arduino and Raspberry Pi last year, not last year, a couple of years ago. And last year we had to stop all these remotely equipment, but it's very easy. Likewise, you can also switch to softwares that can easily are already pre-configured. For example, NI's LabVIEW. If you had a license of LabVIEW, LabVIEW allows you to integrate any kind of complex equipment to a web interface. So you can do that. If you are not interested, like we are, we wanted to avoid LabVIEW, so we did it in HTML5 and a basic data engine. So there are colleagues in IIT Bombay who have done that with Scilab, for example. And you can, all you might consider is mentally project yourself as faculty member. Just think of it as a PCB with basic electronic circuits. So it will be like us going back to our first year of our college days. So it's a very nostalgic process, and it gives us a lot of content. It's like kids playing on Lego. So you can do that as well. And if you look at it, for example, we did a solar panel experiment that we just took out very recently. Something like 20 types of nano solar storage and solar devices were connected. One of the first experiments was done in our lab. We did that with the solar panel, with a device, with a DAC device that we connected it. And then we started our entire solar or energy lab based on that phenomena. Our hardware setup is very easy. You need to have a student or a colleague who can just do the front end if you're not familiar with it. Otherwise, you can do it. It takes 2 days or 3 days to learn, and then do it in a couple of weeks, couple of days. After that, in a week or two, you're already up. Architecture involves setting up a server. We call that the RT server, to collect the data of the users and usage patterns. And then you might have to set up an IP camera, and these days it's very cheap to buy. And you can set up also an interface that teaches people to connect this equipment to the server. I'm going to skip most of this and say these are exercises that you can Google out. You can find papers on the internet. And it was very much a fun exercise for my colleagues, for my staff in my lab. We developed neuron-based robots. We developed neuron-based circuits. We created single neuron-based phenomena. We developed robotic hand over the internet. You can test a lot of those examples. We also tried a few years ago, as I mentioned, we moved from LabVIEW, we moved to a Java-based web server and Raspberry Pi combination. And it's amazing if you want to try it. It's very easy. It promotes a lot of these undergraduate projects as well. So you can definitely try open hardware and FOSS as a combination if you do not have anything at home. And it takes, let's say the first experiment could cost us something like 30 to 40, let's say 3,000 rupees, 2,000 to 3,000 rupees, depending on where you're buying Raspberry Pi and some of the equipment from. And you can try it. If you put more expensive equipment in the beginning, please be careful to study the process even before you do that. On the virtual lab platform, we created assignment phenomena where Typically, we created a platform that were friendly to a student and not to a teacher. So the student assigns saying so and so is my teacher, and once assigned, the teacher can assign or provide assignments. So we conducted several, let's say 5,000 students, of 1,000 students, 996 of students of Sri Ramakrishna Engineering College, for example, took a test online in the early years. There was BMS in Bangalore who did the same thing, for example, and they did massive numbers. So you can test, you can also look at virtual lab based testing of laboratory skills, or what not to do wrong, or what to do right, or what the concept is. I'll skip a few. These are examples of how to use. Our platforms are free. Please register it. It's vlab.amrita.edu. Just you can use your Google ID or some account, university ID to register, and then you get a screen. If let's say you have another account, you can register yourself as a student. If you are requesting us, we will elevate you as a professor, and then you can play a lot with it. So this is all that you can do. You can publish experiments cheap, publish assignments quickly. And we had a lot of fun. We started delivering, these are old pictures, the last being 2000, but just wanted to tell you, we went with school kids in Kollam. We started looking at how they behave. We started looking at different phenomena across, and we interacted with several faculty members. We even had the Nobel laureate, our adjunct faculty, Lee Hartwell, tell us what is sustainable education into these models. He was very curious to see our virtual labs as a sustainability model. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples that come from our research, something like 80 papers, 80 conference/journal papers, or maybe let's say a little more than that. But we found out that we define user behavior differently when we use tools like this. So there is a relationship that changes when you introduce tools as supplementary, virtual labs as a tool in education. So you create a new matrix between user behavior, students, and teachers. Your interaction with students doesn't change, but your interaction with students also completely integrates to a different context that was previously not relevant. And these are tests that we did pre-COVID. So we don't know how much more critical. We already think it's very critical, but we do not have data from, let's say, 1,500 students or something to say what is the scenario to compare today. We are doing it. We are collecting data today. Early years, we also looked at virtual labs as an educational model or a tool. And that's what we did. We did a TAM survey. We did user interaction studies. We realized that in biology, people love to understand experimental work much in animation format more than remote triggered. In engineering, students wanted remotely controlled experiments or simulations more than animations. And these are things which means that an engineering student might come and tell you, don't tell me this, I already know it. That's a common phenomenon. So now we ask the question, what happens when the teacher is not present? And we realized that the question was very different. We realized that then in the absence of a teacher, in the absence of physical absence of a teacher, on an online teacher or a remote teacher, we found that the animations and simulations were very critical. Exam time, people would come and write to us saying, your simulator is not working. All other times they would remain silent. We also looked at graduating students. We had students who were not non-performers, not super performers. You shouldn't say, maybe they were not so good in exams. So when we tried students like that, we realized that virtual labs are online interactive textbooks, interactions that teachers cannot afford to do, or teachers can afford to do in terms of time, but not in terms of resources. Virtual labs supplements them. And students agree to it. I'm talking about huge surveys, something like 20 questions, 30 questions. We are looking at perception of that surveys. These are all papers. If you go to some of if you Google me up and go to our publications, you can find some of it, or you can go to virtual labs and you can drop down the publication list. What was very interesting is that we found that our students were divergers. Divergers are people who think, who have concrete experience and reflective observation. In terms of virtual lab users, rather in the Kolb's learning model, which means that, assimilators. I meant to say that we looked at assessing effectiveness beyond for a classroom versus non-classroom use as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because we need a lot more data to say whether individual experiences are different during times today. We specifically did questions like we asked 4 questions like, for example, how cost effective do you perceive it? And perception doesn't change. So we asked people who would contradict in their regular perception, how they would integrate virtual labs, how they felt about virtual labs during a non-phenomena. And this was very, very interesting for us. So we asked different set of questions and we could find a lot of answers like usabilities. We looked at metacognition and different other phenomena that you would normally see in a classroom. That you would normally not worry about in a classroom. And when you go into an autonomous learning behavior, whether it is a student who doesn't pay attention in classroom or whether it's a student who is not available in a classroom, you have the same problems. So we started challenging ourselves, saying, as educationists, what should be our future focus? So we asked simple questions, simple sets of questions like, do you familiarize techniques? And we found that these questions are critical to map to some of our studies. These are some conferences and journals that you can Google up. We looked at efficacy of student feedback and phenomena. One of the nice studies that we did is we were constant for 6 or 7 years. We asked each other, many of our colleagues asked each other, is virtual lab exercise that has to come before a physical lab or after a physical lab? So we did this in a chemistry study. We looked at in a physics study, in a physics laboratory, first year physical laboratory. We did what is called control group, where they did only non-laboratory education, classroom education. So we call it CT, classroom teaching. They went through an assessment, then they went through another assessment. Then they went through, let's say, a virtual lab. Virtual lab group went through another assessment. From after the second assessment, they went to a physical lab. This was the first group. We call them the CVP group. The second one was CPL, physical laboratory, and then virtual laboratory. And we did the same test. And this is a nice paper in education and information technology if you want to look at how you can change student assessments. We looked at 3 basic phenomena: metacognition, analogical reasoning, and transfer of knowledge. And we found out that people who did very small, in a very tiny level, people who did virtual labs before the physical labs could understand stuff in a physical laboratory environment even better than a person who did physical lab and virtual lab. By the way, when I say that, I put a word of caution. The difference is very, very tiny, but it's huge when you compare to the students who don't have laboratory skilling. So during COVID times, I think you have only 2 options. You have primarily, I'm waiting until the colleges and universities reopen. We have only classroom teaching, which we do through online, and we don't have any physical labs. So we might only have to have virtual labs in the next few months. I don't know how long we are going to go with this. The prediction with my colleagues in Oxford is India and UK might be similar. Things might be very normal after March 21, but until then we'll have some difficulties. I hope we'll open early and things will be even more normal. Let's assume some predictions can go wrong. These are all assessments, and I'm not the expert here, but we also did in 2018, we did, by the way, Krishnashree Achyutan is the main person behind virtual labs at Amrita. Professor Krishnashree, who's our Dean PG programs, set up to, let's say, set up a set of studies in chemistry. She's a material science professor, background with, she used to work for AMD in the past before joining Amrita in 2007. She did with undergraduate students to see how students perceive what is called alternate conceptions in molecular asymmetry. And we could understand where virtual labs would be an amazing success, and because we knew where virtual labs are failures. For example, in microscopy, people love to learn things, but they do make mistakes. So virtual labs were not the best complementary tools for microscopy. You can teach them how to analyze data, but to teach the tricks of microscopy, it's like the theoretical knowledge between swimming and real world. So we can only provide a set of complementary skills, whereas virtual labs are amazing in correcting people's misconceptions, or otherwise what chemistry folks, many of you would call as alternative conceptions in molecular asymmetry. This is a paper that's, you can, it's all open, most of them are open access, you can download it. So we could understand that there was a big difference in what control students would go, and a small difference between those who did virtual labs first performed much better than those who did physical labs first. So there is a huge difference between what would happen. I'm going to throw this to say we have a very big increase. I think large percentage of increase of users across last few years, and we see hits from different parts of the country. Some, I mean, this is not the complete data. We see a lot of hits from JK, from South India. It's a huge number. You know, we have a good number from Tamil Nadu. I am from Coimbatore, so I pay a lot of attention to see what's happening there as well. So we see a lot of clicks from Chennai area, from Kovai area, and different parts of Tamil Nadu. We have lots of hits from, let's say, Bihar, which is from college institutions in Bihar. But usually in some states, we see a hike during the examination period or when there is an assignment, because we also see during the time we get feedback saying, I need help in this assignment. Today, we are approximately 140, 170 or 150 plus nodal centers, which are working with us to help develop or help spread tools and skilling with tools. I can, just to give you the figures, these are the figures that we developed of all the experiments online. So if you look at all our partners, you can pick it up. And I'll stop here. I'll open up for questions. Like every lab member would say, none of the work that I do in my lab is related to mine alone. There's a lot of people helping me. Virtual lab is an integrated work. A lot of my faculty colleagues actually run their entire teams without taking credit. And sometimes they are so kind that things happen because of their sharing and their advice. And that's the big picture. These are my research collaborators. With that, I also have to tell you the National Mission on Education through ICT virtual labs slightly changed perspective. So now we learned that people could develop labs that are specifically, let's say, can be studied or can be developed by individual professors. We can help you hosting your experiments. If you go, IIT Bombay is hosting a portal which allows you to put your experiments on there, on our common portal, and your experiments will also come up as virtual labs very soon. There is not significant amount of money to develop new labs right now, which might come in the next phase, but we are finishing a phase. So right now the current phase was about outreach and phenomena. So there might actually be a possibility to set up a lot of different stuff. My request is that please choose labs that are within undergraduate and postgraduate curriculum and can be used. If you're doing research style labs, please make sure that you test the labs before you make it publicly online, because there are a lot more issues in a research lab. And it's an easy way to create student force to generate, let's say, papers. So a lot of our work, for example, has ended up as conference and research papers. And these are not related to my neuroscience research or my neuroinformatics research, but generally you will find that it's very, very mind-boggling and changing that you end up being the student rather than a learner in these experiences, and virtual labs can do that for us. So with that, that's our campus. The right side is our Arabian Sea, the left side, sorry, this is not our campus, this is where we stay. The campus is just across that small bridge here. That's our campus. So that's a September evening, I think 2 years ago, that we took a picture. Thank you so much. If you have questions, if you have inputs, I am happy to answer that for you.
So thank you, sir. Actually, the campus is very beautiful, and where you stay is also, it's very, very nice, actually. So actually, it is very nice to hear your talk about actually virtual concept from the basics and how to build and where to apply, what are the drawbacks, all these things. So actually we are very happy to actually be with you for past 1 hour. You completed on time, so now we can hear from our faculty for the discussion. So if anybody
So,
have
yeah,
any queries, you can.
Yuvraj sir, can I ask question?
Yeah, yes sir, yes sir.
Yeah. So, Dr. Divakar, so it was a very informative talk. So actually, I'm happy that you have covered almost all the aspects in a short time. So it was like the most important component which I found that you touched each and every part that is actually important for us, that we must know. So like our question is like, because once like the faculty development program that we are having right now is based on the fact that we have to also establish similar labs. So because not only from the point of view only of the COVID, but as you already mentioned that it will be a different learning experience for the students. So I'll have a few questions, like if I can ask in a series.
Please
So
do,
I
please
hope
do.
like, if there is overlap with other faculty members, so they can skip that question. So the first thing is like when you like categorize the experiments, you mentioned that there are some measurement based experiments, like which I expect mostly will be the component of the physics. So modeling, simulating labs, they are very important for the engineering component. But from physics point of view, so most of the labs, I think they will be measurement based. So in that regard, like when you're like when we are trying to do these measurement based labs, so what are the essential components? Like if we can skip this simulation, or just based on some minimal modeling we can do that, the measurement based experiments.
May I ask you, Professor
Yeah,
Rohit,
Rohit, yeah.
are you planning to use these labs for teaching or for research?
Yeah, it is for teaching. I'm not asking for research. I understand your point because you mentioned in the last statement that it has to
So,
be tested, and yeah.
so for example, I'll give you an analog.
Yeah.
Most physics teaching labs cannot be just measurement labs. Measurement labs are training tools post basic phenomena.
Okay.
So you would have to start with a simulation lab or an animation based or simulation based lab where there's math teaching the principle behind it. And the
Okay.
measurement is only to teach where real world data interfaces with that assumptive model.
Okay.
Other, for example, our physics labs, if you go to our physical sciences lab, all the undergraduate syllabi,
Mm.
most of the physics labs have been, we have content in our physical sciences. We have, I think, 8 labs in physics. So most of them are primarily simulators.
Okay. So.
For example,
Mm.
in my case, I am in the process, not funded, of course, but we are developing what is called an EEG lab, where we are looking at a measurement lab. So the EEG signals that I capture in our lab, we are also doing EEG, by the way, non-surface EEG. The electroencephalography signals that we capture, we can build labs that will allow editing those signals, but those are a different style of labs. Those are slightly more research oriented. You might not get your student engagement working with it.
Okay.
So you might consider that you should have to do 2 modalities.
Okay.
Initial lab that will be basically teaching a component of what you would see in a textbook or in your content in your slide. That would be more a math based, let's say emulation, not simulation, because sometimes math can't do it. It's
Okay.
too complex. So you can emulate a mathematical phenomena or
Okay.
a physical phenomena. And the second part that you can do is you can give real data and see whether it fits a measurement phenomena.
Okay. So the second question that I have, like you mentioned that there are like that say there are some requirements. So like what hardware requirements we have other than Raspberry? You mentioned that okay, like we require some permanent node for just keeping all those things ready for the students for future years also.
You will very easily find a lot of good references that tell you different hybrid models. So one good,
Mm.
one simple suggestion that I have is you might have to have a server that actually runs the simulator. So it will be a web server. You might
Okay.
also need a database server that allows you to aggregate data.
Okay.
So you might prefer to isolate these two as two independent physical devices, not on two different nodes, like on a blade server, for example,
Okay.
but not connected to it. Most of the time you would prefer that your RT, remote equipment, or your measurement content are placed on a different server. So if some hacker comes into it, you are not losing. I'm not talking about ethical hackers. I'm talking about the other
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah. Okay.
When they come into it, you lose both your source code or your data or your deployment. So you might have to consider maybe one or two independent physical devices and one or two or more than two virtual technologies to support it. In terms of hardware, most of the physics experiments may need a power source. We usually sometimes we need a current device, typically a current source or something like that. And most of the times, like for example, our UTM device, universal testing machine, requires its own setup by itself. So you might do some of that. Metal testing, microscopy, for example, requires you can choose what range of microscopy you want, and nowadays you get all these products built in, and the servers come built in. So all you have to do is create a XML feed from your microscope
Okay.
onto your server, BL server, and
Okay.
then you can trigger it on off, trigger on, trigger off. You might if you have very interesting students who can do extra stuff, they can even create things that will open and close when it's not needed.
Okay. So the next question is about like the platform that you mentioned actually. So are there any open source platform which are I'm saying from the point of view, users point of view, they are very effective and has been used like with a lot of developments coming on more frequently than any other software.
So I'm proud to say India's
Yeah.
project is one of the largest user deployment in this planet. So
Mm.
we have a very significant large number of users on the platform, and
Okay.
it's not an issue. For example, but these are platform technologies. You don't have to worry about it so much. You just have to create with any kind of LMS. You
Yeah.
can start with the Moodle platform if you want, but Moodle is more about creating textbooks. But concept, that's why I said virtual labs can be interactive textbooks of
Okay.
the future.
So triple IT one Hyderabad, that one is the better one. Yeah,
It's also very good. It's actually the only thing you might, to start off, you might need a little bit of help to begin.
mm.
Ours was
If,
more
mm.
about people like biologists and others to start off. In fact, when the Amrita platform is deploy and start writing directly. Triple
Okay.
IT is also similar, but you might need a couple. Maybe you should definitely team up with a computer science colleague, and he might even tell you very
Okay.
easily how to skip this process.
Okay. And the next question is regarding like you said that the Scilab or LabVIEW, that these are the like software those are like used alongside. So other than that, any open source, because LabVIEW is it's very expensive if you
Yes.
go for the license. So how about the open source software so that
Sorry,
uh,
let me repeat. LabVIEW is not open source. Scilab is an alternative to partial work that MATLAB or LabVIEW would do.
yeah.
I'm
So
not
I'm asking for open source, the
correct.
alternative, open source alternative rather than these.
So the best is that,
Mm.
from our experience, the best is that you code it yourself. And you have
Okay.
very nice
Okay.
Python libraries. We have
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
nice JavaScript
Okay.
libraries.
Mm.
Just code it from scratch. We did
Okay.
everything in JavaScript and HTML5 in the
Okay.
last 6 years.
Okay. So then I have one more question is regarding this. Like when you said that there is like you already did in final that you have done first the classroom teaching, then virtual lab, then the physical lab. So then you like flipped also that from CPV to CVP.
Yes. No,
So sorry,
CPP to
CVP
CPV.
to CPV.
Yes.
So that now like when you are like designing such experiments, so that how much is like that regenerative feedback that you are getting, and how long, how much you are just trying to reframe your experiments based on the user's need, or so how much? it is important in that particular context, because it will vary from student to student. So based on the learning experience, so how much they are important in that sense.
Very wonderful question. In fact, here peer review comes into a critical component. So when you develop virtual lab experiments, please get it peer reviewed before you start developing them, which means that you make sure IIT Bombay, for example, set up this process for the current developers where every stage of your process goes through a peer review, uh, from defining the objectives, defining the methodology, defining. So when you draw your skills, when you're converting, when you're implementing the virtual lab, what you implement defines the learning goals of some of your technology. So please be careful about that and start with that as a process.
Okay. Okay. Thank you,
So
Dr. Diwakar. It was
thank you.
very nice. So
Okay. So now so we can hear it
Yeah,
from
Anand, do you
Janani.
hear me? Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Janani ma'am, yeah, yes ma'am.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, Professor Jenny, yes, I can hear you.
Shyam sir, your explanation was really wonderful. I have a couple of questions. If you allow me, I can ask.
Please do.
Can I ask you?
Please do.
My question sounds simple. From the basics, actually, you are telling about virtual lab setup in the initial slides, where you had a SketchUp. From the SketchUp, you went to the animation, and finally model the animation into a simulator. But reality is always a reality. So I ask your opinion about blending, taking a laboratory, videographing a laboratory, really, and then blending it to an animation, how it sounds, then
Okay.
converting into a simulator. Because I have taken some videos in our lab, reality wise, students feel like the teacher is there with them always. That's what blending a real videography along with adding animations in the middle together with the simulation. What's your suggestion, opinion, and development on it?
Professor
That's
Jenny,
my first question.
it's a beautiful way of saying it, but I got to tell you, when you say, when we take a video, although we feel it's the real world, as an educational component, it just becomes one of the many components. The real world, the video really helps. That's why I said many of our labs, we also have real video. I'm talking about first year undergrad. It doesn't, it's the basic step. But when you want to transfer it to a laboratory skilling process, you need to engage a user. And the students who say, or learners, not just students, also professors in colleges who say, I've seen the lab already, it doesn't imply that you can grade a student with that, or you can grade a learning process with that. So we found out that you need to create multiple components. Video is one of the components. You need to create a theory component. You might need to do an assignment component. You might need to do a post exercise component and another a quiz before and an assignment later. You might have to create all these modules. In fact, if you go to India's virtual lab mission projects and all the partners, we did this exercise in 2009. We spent time identifying which component is critical. So the more complex your laboratory is, the more complex your experiment is, you need to add more components to it and simplify certain components for let's say diversified user. So there are, so you might, your video component is very critical. I wouldn't say replace it. In fact, everybody does it. We do it too. And I'm very happy you did it. But translating that into a interactive process would be where you would start calling it a lab. Until then, it'll be like an NPTEL lecture.
Yeah, correct. And my second question is, you were telling about haptics, some new word which we are hearing.
Okay.
Haptics. Haptics gives real-time animation, like that you are speaking.
Sorry.
So
Haptics gives you real-time force feedback.
you are telling like the animation looks real, like a real world, using the word. Yeah.
Haptics is a typical phenomena in gaming community today. 10 years when we were starting, it was not that popular. There was something called a phantom device, which was a purely haptic device. It's basically, in the past, it was a game controller. Haptics means I receive force feedback. So for example, my colleague is teaching 10,000, already taught 10,000 women plumbers in Kerala using haptic devices, using the Apta skilling device. So what it does is it gives you the feel of the force that you're providing. So when you grab, let's say, a conical flask, when you integrate haptics into it, you cannot scale haptics because you need to have a haptic device also at the user end. But if you have it in your lab and you distribute it to students, during that process, they learn, they receive certain force feedback, and that sensory perception during a force feedback is much more a motor memory than any other kind of learning phenomena. So you can learn a lot more. Students learn a lot more. Like, for example, if you want to teach anything with sign language, you need to have a haptic device. That's much easier.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
I am Devanand. Do you hear me?
Yes, Professor Devanand.
Okay, it's a nice presentation. And when coming to basic biological laboratories like microbial laboratories or molecular work, where you want to train the students on casting gels or running DNA or RNA, or even to some extent on staining techniques. So how come visual laboratory can replace a real-time laboratory? And for especially for undergraduates, where the hands-on training plays a very important role in the outcome. No, so how can that replace a real-time laboratory?
I'm glad you asked that. We never replace it. I'm sorry if there is any conventional meaning. It's like saying it's a complementary skill set. We only complement skills using virtual laboratories. A real lab will never change. Going to a volcano is different from reading about a volcano. So there is a lot of difference there. However, if skilling is about telling the students, for example, if you are in a lab, if you count the number of minutes that a student actually performs in a lab, it's a few minutes or a couple of tens of minutes. It's no more than that. The rest of the time, he or she holds a structure or a field. For example, running a gel is a phenomena that needs to go through where, for example, if you look at our page, agarose gel electrophoresis or polyacrylate gel electrophoresis virtual labs, you will see that several learning components of the lab is attended to. It never replaces the lab. It's only making sure those learning components that you learn in a laboratory practice are more integrated into your teaching, into your skilling process. So just like you explaining in front of students, so it's like you questioning us or me questioning you, for example, by saying, why are you standing and talking in a lab? Let the students do it. That won't happen. You need to explain to the students what the experiment is. This is that process. Sometimes you can go a step further. You hold the device with them. This virtual lab phenomena can probably come close to that. It never replaces it. I'm sorry, I mean, you are 100% right. I'm very happy you raised it. It never replaces a physical laboratory, and nobody should use it that sense. But in a scenario where if the student is at 10 p.m. in a hostel room and he wants to practice a skill or to remember a skill, you provide this as an interface.
So what I understand is, do you mean to say that very critical parts of experiment, like loading a DNA in a well during agarose electrophoresis or handling a cancer cell in animal cell culture laboratory, these things cannot be replaced, or we can only explain them theoretically in a virtual lab and make them to do it by person, maybe after a time when they come back to the laboratory. So this is what you mean to say?
Many of you are more excellent professors, probably much better than me. So I'm going to say this with a lot of basic lack of understanding. I'm going to say virtual labs are like the textbooks of the future. That's it.
Oh,
they are no more than that. Physical laboratories right now in COVID times, if you want a student to graduate, probably you need to look at technologies that help you help them. The other thing is, forget students, for teachers, it cuts down time very huge extent and improves the transfer of knowledge in a much different way. So the student metacognises the concept much better. He brings in a divergent thinking, which means analogical reasoning comes in. But the facilitation that comes from transfer of knowledge that happens between, let's say, a person like you and your student will be much, much higher than standard teaching approach. Like, for example, me talking like this, it would be much different if I ask you, go to vlab.amrita.edu and do the page experiment or do our 12 molecular biology undergraduate level experiments and the postgraduate experiments or bacterial species experiment, whichever that you want to do it. Doing the virtual lab will be very different from talking about it. So it's like, we often see our students telling us, oh, I didn't understand, now I get it. So which is like asking them to describe the taste of sugar if they didn't know the taste of sugar. That's all. It doesn't replace a lab. it's important to tell you that it will never replace a lab.
Thank you so much.
So now, Karthikeyan sir.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Sir, this is Sharon. Can I talk with the speaker?
No, actually, you can raise the hand. Already, Karthikeyan sir raised the hand, so he can continue, ma'am.
Okay.
After that, I
I'll
will
wait.
call you. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Shyam, that for your comprehensive presentation on this online virtual lab. I just add to the first question asked by the Professor Rohit Deer about that in the physics laboratory, actually that explaining the principles and all these things that happens face to face in the classroom before starting the experiment. So, and the experiment happens purely measurement based. In between that, we have interactions, why it is happening, how it is happening. So that is how that, that physics labs that presently, we used to carry. So principles are discussed beforehand and during the, experiment. So as you said, it can be started with a simulation or emulation, so that, for a virtual scenario. Okay, sir. So it can be started with a simulation, and then a lab, that virtual lab, we can go directly. So like that in this scenario you were telling. So now I think there are open source that where we can do the simulation of the principles before this. So can you just elaborate that open source for these principles, suppose physical sciences related principles? I hope that the development what has happened, is it sufficient to cater the present scenario?
So very wonderful question, sir, and your understanding is absolutely right. I didn't mean to say we don't teach principles. I'm talking about reintegrating and checking. So for example, if somebody would ask us the feel of a particular device or an experiment, explaining about an experiment, let's say diffraction experiment, and taking the student to a lab has two different learning objectives. Taking a student to a lab is all about allowing the student to perceive the equipment for himself. So when it comes to virtual labs, you will definitely look at a first set of a learning set of goals. All of this comes after a classroom teaching. Classroom teaching is very different from, let's say, virtual lab skilling process as well. So you would start by saying, this is what the principle of physics that underlies this phenomena is. That's classroom teaching. You will talk about the equipment, talk about the device, etc. In a lab, you will tell them, you will show, let's say, in a physical lab, you'll show them the device and tell them, these are the knobs, these are the changes, this is how it works, even before they even feel the lab. So that's one phenomenon that common thing happens. In a virtual lab, you'll say the same, you or your professors will actually describe diagrammatically, or let's say mathematically, you will set up a equivalent learning interface where you say, instead of that knob, I have these sliders or this knob that you can turn.
Yes, sir.
That's what I call as simulation.
Yeah.
Then of course you can fine tune, or you can even give better experiments with measurement data. So measurement data requires that we collect the data on different scenarios. One of the things with measurement data is that in a virtual lab, at least to my limited understanding, you will see that what is critical during a virtual lab measurement style process, it's interesting to see that students are curious to learn where not to go wrong, then where to go, where to learn, what is right. So you might have to invest mentally. We are not taught to do that in real classrooms, but in a virtual world, you may have to invest a lot more resources as a professor to understand not only what goes right, but also what can go wrong.
Yeah. Okay.
In measurement data, in terms of data, sorry.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kumar sir. Lakshmi Kumar sir.
Yeah. It was very presentation, and it was really thought-provoking. Just I have a small doubt. So, did you? What I am trying to ask is, online platform experiments. See now, because of this pandemic only, so many of us are thinking doing the online classes and online experiments and online learning. So, but already many universities or many institutions, they have already, existing curriculum. So, what kind of changes do you expect for this curriculum? And what kind of amendments to suggest? To go for online training of this experiment. Can you comment on this?
Sure. So my colleague Kamal Bijilani developed what is called AView a few years ago. I think 2009 or 10. Yeah. So AView, in those days there was no need. In some cases it was a big need. And I still remember a classroom of attendees who attended a 250 lecturers from different parts of India joined for a virtual lab talk, and I had a very nice experience with them. We couldn't ask this many questions, but one of the things that we change with this current scenario that I see with our usage is that students take time initially to come into a virtual lab platform. They find not both students and professors, let's say we have a lot of resistance to change. We try to think it's complex, but students change faster than us, and that's very risky for us. So if professors, we don't adapt our teaching methodologies to the new generation, that what I call as the TikTok / Facebook revolution, we might stay backseated. Students do not want us to repeat. For example, in many of our online classes, in the past, compared to a direct classroom, you could repeat as many number of times. If you repeat content, it's a bad idea now. If the same thing goes for laboratory skilling, and we always say that's not a good idea in laboratories. We need to reinforce how to make sure that. So when you develop virtual labs, when you think about next generation virtual labs, please make sure that the reinforcement are going through checks. Lectures are integrated into the checks, and you can ask questions about it. For example, my colleagues are using a MOOC, developing MOOCs here constantly. And one of the MOOCs that they look at is every few minutes you need to interact with a virtual lab style experiment question. So the thing is that if you have user interaction, which was not needed in the past, people would just leave it on and they would go away. If I don't see your face, in many cases it was meant that I didn't attend. Today, if I didn't see your face, I don't care, because he or she might be a night person and may attend from 2 to 3 in the morning.
Yes.
So we may have to adapt as professors. I think one of the biggest challenges that is happening because of this 2-3 months of lockdown is that we have to adapt from what used to be a regular life, what used to be a specialty, into what is called a regular life. So teachers will go through a lot more difficulties in the initial phase. I myself am concerned how my neuroscience course would be, because I taught partially online and without seeing the students. My other concern is, as a person in neuroscience, I think it was a big issue to see people with ADHD, attention deficit disorders. You need to be extremely careful with some students as well. So virtual labs, on the other hand, are slightly different from online lectures. So they're not necessarily online lectures. So having a lecture component is great, but it allows you to complement, to test, get a feedback from. So you can also perceive as the need to develop virtual labs is a way to get appropriate feedback as a teacher.
But do you suggest some quick comments on the existing curriculum to adapt completely this online learning?
Can you repeat, sir?
Yeah. Do you suggest some quick amendments to the existing curriculum to adapt this online learning completely in this pandemic time?
I am very limited in my ability to study the current scenario, but I don't think we should ever avoid any of these methods. I think it's critical that as a group of faculty living in 2020, this family of teachers that we are should actually embrace both styles. We should expect that regularity comes back in a few months, but in the meantime, yes, future students will constantly be much different from the current generation. So maybe this is a training period for us to look at possibilities to reduce our teaching load and improve our ability to understand them when we are not in front of them. So this is also a possibility that we should look at.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Joe, Shireen ma'am, are you there, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yeah, you can continue.
One quick question. Hello, sir.
Yes, Professor Sherin, please tell
Hello,
me.
Divakar, sir.
Please tell me.
Sir, actually, it's a very nice idea to develop a virtual lab. It's very mind-boggling a presentation. Sir, actually, I was about to ask, you were providing opportunities for the students to attend workshops. Likewise, are you providing any training or workshop programs for faculties to tell them how to develop such kind of platforms or like that? If it's so, it will be very useful for us.
We have been doing that in the past. To answer the question, yes, we did that in the past. There are people nowadays, just to let you know, Professor Sherin, I think if you are, there are so many tutorials on the net sometimes that can help to complement that if you don't need it. I mean, we can try to organize something, but we haven't done that in the last 2 months. That's also a mistake from my side. We haven't done anything in the last 2-3 months to aid developers or future developers of the community. But yes, it's very, very easy to show how to do it and how to set up a simple lab. But when I say simple, please, with all my, please apologize for using the term nanomaterial. So nanosolar, for example, it's not an easy field to develop experiments in. Undergraduate's curriculum in physics and chemistry are much easier. But if you come into complex technologies, the more complex you get, the more work one has to put in. My estimate is that, for example, based on my experience in neuroscience, is that a very complex lab is a minimum of, let's say, 8 to 16 weeks for a dedicated professor. Just to let you know, I'm talking about a production.
Hello, Shyam sir.
Hello. Hello.
Shyam sir, are you there?
I think his network connection is weak.
Yes.
Okay.
He'll come back soon.
We can wait, sir.